Today we read John chapter 9. As Jesus was going along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. "Teacher," his disciples asked him, "whose sin was it that caused this man to be born blind? Did he sin or did his parents?" "He didn't sin," replied Jesus, "nor did his parents. It happened so that God's works could be seen in him. We must work the works of the one who sent me as long as it's still daytime. The night is coming and nobody can work then. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world." With these words, he spat on the ground and made some mud out of his spittle. He spread the mud on the man's eyes. "Off you go," he said to him, "and wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went off and washed. When he came back, he could see. His neighbors and the people who used to see him begging remarked on this. "Isn't this the man," they said, "who used to sit here and beg?" "Yes, it's him," said some of them. "No, it isn't," said some others. "It's somebody like him." But the man himself spoke. "Yes, it is me," he said. "Well then," they said to him, "how did your eyes get opened?" "It was the man called Jesus," he replied. "He made some mud and then he spread it on my eyes and told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and I could see." "Where is he?" they asked. "I don't know," he replied. They took the man who'd been blind and brought him to the Pharisees. The day that Jesus had made the mud and opened his eyes was a Sabbath. So the Pharisees began to ask him again how he had come to see. "He put some mud on my eyes," he said, "and I washed, and now I can see." "Well, the man can't be from God," some of the Pharisees began to say. "He doesn't keep the Sabbath." "Well, but," replied some of the others, "how can a man who's a sinner do signs like these?" And they were divided. So they spoke to the blind man again. "What have you got to say about him?" they said. "He opened your eyes, after all." "He's a prophet," he replied. The Judeans didn't believe that he'd really been blind and now he could see, so they called the parents of the newly sighted man and put the question to them. "Is this man really your son?" they asked. "The one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see?" "Well," replied his parents, "we know that he is indeed our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how it is that he can now see, and we don't know who it was that opened his eyes. Ask him. He's a grown-up. He can speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Judeans. The Judeans, you see, had already decided that if anyone declared that Jesus was the Messiah, they should be put out of the synagogue. That's why his parents said, "He's grown up, so you should ask him." So for the second time, they called for the man who'd been blind. "Give God the glory," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." "I don't know whether he's a sinner or not," replied the man. "All I know is this. I used to be blind, and now I can see." "What did he do to you?" they asked. "How did he open your eyes?" "I told you already," replied the man, "and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You don't want to become his disciples too, do you?" "You're his disciple," they scoffed. "But we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we don't know where this man comes from." "Well, here's a fine thing," replied the man. "You don't know where he's from, and he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is devout and does his will, he listens to them. It's never, ever been heard of before that someone should open the eyes of a person born blind. If this man wasn't from God, he couldn't do anything." "You were born in sin from top to toe," they replied, "and are you going to start teaching us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, and he found him and he spoke to him. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" he asked. "Who is he, sir?" asked the man, "so I can believe in him." "You've seen him," replied Jesus. "In fact, it's the person who's talking to you." "Yes, sir," said the man, "I do believe." And he worshipped him. "I came into the world for judgment," said Jesus, "so that those who can't see would see, and so that those who can see would become blind." Some of the Pharisees were nearby, and they heard this. "So," they said, "we're blind too, are we?" "If you were blind," replied Jesus, "you wouldn't be guilty of sin. But now, because you say we can see, your sin remains."
Thank you. What an awesome story. This is one of my favorite stories in the New Testament. And I've titled the message today, "He Makes the Blind to Speak." That's not a typo. Of course, the obvious miracle in this story is that Jesus gave a man his sight who had been blind since birth. We find out later in the story that he's an adult, so he's been blind for quite a few years. I've heard people talk about this story numerous times, and when Jesus says in answer to his disciples, they ask, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus says, no one sinned, but that the glory of God might be revealed in him. I've had people talk about that and said that God kept this man blind from birth so that this day when Jesus walked by, Jesus could heal him and that would bring God glory. I think that's a horrible way to interpret this story. The inference is that God has made this guy blind for all of these years just so Jesus could come by and get a little glory out of it. I think there's a much better way to understand what's happening in this story. And if you understand it that way that I think is wrong, you miss the big point of the story. The obvious miracle certainly is that Jesus gave this blind man his sight. But something else, another miracle or miracles takes place in this story too. This picture I've used today is part of a bronze door on St. James Cathedral in Seattle. So you see Jesus healing the blind man there, and then another man raising his arm, pointing to Jesus, actually talking about Jesus. So I thought this was interesting. It actually, if you read the description of this relief, that man on the left with his arm raised is a different man than the man who was blind. But in the context of this story, I'd like us to think of him as the same man on the right being healed by Jesus of his blindness, and on the left speaking, because he says a lot in this story. I don't know that there's another story in the New Testament where somebody that Jesus healed or delivered has as much to say after the fact as this guy does. So John, the author of the Gospel of John, is more than a historian. So we do well to keep that in mind when we read these stories in John. These are called signs in John. So he's speaking theologically to us, and they reveal more than just the historic events themselves. So in this story, Jesus is walking along with the disciples. He sees a blind man, and as he's walking along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. So the common belief of primitive religions, and even today a lot of people do, was that physical handicaps, sickness, disease were evidence of a moral problem, evidence of something you're doing wrong, and then God either allows or actively causes blindness or some symptom like this to come on you, basically to punish you. I can't tell you how many times I've had Christians come to ask me, they're going through some difficult time in their life, and the thing that they immediately go to is, what have I done wrong to deserve this? That's a really wrong way to think about God. He doesn't do that. He doesn't visit us with sickness and disease and calamity to get us to repent. Now, those things can get us to repent, but they're not sent by God. God is only good. He only gives good gifts to his children. He doesn't give us evil gifts. He doesn't give us a serpent when we ask for a bread, right? So in that culture, and even in this culture today, when Jesus says nobody sinned and to cause this man to be blind, it was and is a radical statement. Jesus is clearly not following Moses when he says this statement. And this is why this is such a radical text. Because according to Moses and Deuteronomy, blindness was a curse from God for disobedience. So this little answer that Jesus gives, no one sinned, neither this man or his parents, flew right in the face of their scripture. Jesus is contesting their scripture. I don't think we can water it down. We can't say anything less than that. Jesus is contesting Moses here. He's saying, no, blindness is not a curse. Blindness is not the result of sin or moral failure or disobedience when he says this. And also note, because people believe that, they believe that moral failure would cause blindness, then they excluded handicapped people like this from full participation in their community. their blindness was considered evidence of their sinful behavior. And you would get that idea reading Deuteronomy 28. That's clearly what Deuteronomy 28 is telling you. That's the chapter that lists the blessings and cursings according to whether you were obedient or not. So people would see blind people like this. They would exclude them because they considered their blindness as evidence of their sinful behavior, and then they had no choice but to become beggars. They couldn't take part in the broader social and religious life of their community. So they became essentially invisible to the community, or without full identity or participation in the community. They certainly weren't respected. They weren't respected members of their community. Now, take note that this story begins with a question. Who sinned? That's the question that the story begins with. Who sinned? And it also includes some big assumptions behind that question, right? The assumption when they say who sinned is that this guy wouldn't be blind if somebody hadn't sinned. So we start this story with a question and an assumption. Let's look at how the story ends. In verse 39, Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains." So this can be a little confusing here, but really what Jesus is getting to the point at is if you think you can see clearly to make judgments on people about whether they're sinners or not, you're actually the blind one. It's only those people that acknowledge that they're blind, that they can't make those determinations, that they can't judge righteously on their own, that can actually see. So the story begins with a question and an assumption about sin, but the story ends with a judgment about sin that turns their assumptions about sin upside down. So we can think of it like a story in between two bookends. I use these thinker bookends because have you ever noticed these thinker bookends, and these are quite common, have one thinker facing one direction on the left side of your books or whatever, and then the thinker on the other side is facing the other direction. Why do you suppose that is? It's because of what comes in between causes you to change the way you think. Huh? If the books or the story in between the bookends doesn't have any effect on you, then one of those guys ought to be facing the same way. They both ought to be facing the same way, rather. So the story has bookends. At the beginning, on one end, there's a question about sin, and the question has some assumptions baked into it. On the other end, there's a judgment about those assumptions and about sin itself. The beginning bookend is an assumption that blindness is the result of sin, which justified the exclusion of this blind person. But the ending bookend judges that assumption as incorrect. James Allison does one of the best exegetes of this passage, and I'm just going to use a couple of his quotes today. But here's one of them, how he sums up the story. He sums it up this way: "Sin ceases to be a defect which excludes and comes to be participation in the mechanism of exclusion." So when you read through the story, if you pay with your eyes open, you can see there's actually a redefinition of sin across the breadth of this story. Sin ceases to be a defect which excludes people and comes to be participation in that actual mechanism of exclusion. And this exclusion of those who were considered sinners has some characteristics. And the one I want to focus today is the one that I allude to in my sermon title, "He makes the blind to speak." So certainly this is a story about Jesus giving sight to a blind man. So he made the blind to see. But it is more than that. It's a story of how giving sight to a blind man also gave that man a voice in his community. Let's see how this happens. The story begins with that question: who sinned, this man or his parents? Then in verse 3, Jesus answers, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. Then he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes. And he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. Notice how this man is referred to in the beginning of the story. Never identified by name. He's referred to always kind of in the third person, as if people are talking about him. And then it continues even after he comes back from the pool. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some were saying, it is he. Others were saying, no, but it is someone like him. So in all the references up to this man, up to this point, people are talking about him, but nobody is talking to him. Everybody has a lot to say about this guy, but nobody is conversing with him. He was somebody that people talked about, not someone that people talked with. He had actually been so incidental to his neighbors that a lot of them couldn't even tell if it was him or not. Some said, it is he. Someone said, nah, it's somebody like him. So we've not heard a word from this man up until the second half of verse 9, and then he begins to speak up. He kept saying, I am the man. He's trying to get their attention. It's like, hey, I'm right here. Hello. But they kept asking him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and he said to me, go to Siloam and wash. Then I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. He was probably used to people talking about him, but not talking to him. Like when we walk by beggars in the cities these days, often people will drop some money in their cup, or they'll say, have a good day, or something like that, but they generally don't stop and have a conversation with people like this. But when he gets their attention, they begin to have this conversation with him. This may have been the first significant conversation this man had ever had with his neighbors. Remember, he wasn't like, even the way we think of beggars today, he was considered cursed by God. And you don't want to get too close to people that are cursed by God. You know, some of that curse might rub off on you, or some of their defilement might get on you. So this may have been the first significant conversation this guy had ever had with these neighbors of his. The blind man not only has his sight, but he also has a voice here. And instead of him begging for something from his neighbors are now asking something of him. How were your eyes opened? And where is Jesus? I mean, that's a big question. Where is Jesus? Perhaps for the first time in his life, something is being asked of him. Now the beggar has something his community wants. The community is now begging the beggar. And in giving this man his sight, Jesus has also given him a place in his community that he never had. A place of value. A place where the beggar now has something his community wants. He's never been in this position before. So in an act of just totally gratuitous kindness, Jesus not only opened the eyes of a blind man, he also opened the eyes of his community to this blind man. It's not just the blind man that got his eyes opened this day. His community did too. By opening the eyes of the blind man, not only could the man see his neighbors could now see him. Jesus made him visible to his community. And when he became visible, they saw that he had something of value, something they wanted. They actually saw that he was someone of value. Instead of just talking about him, they asked something of him. This all happened because Jesus knew something that these people didn't know. He knew that this man was no different than anybody else. He knew that he wasn't especially sinful. He knew that he wasn't cursed by God, even though their scriptures told him that he was. That's what the people thought, but Jesus knew something else. Jesus knew he was different in only one way. He was incomplete. Not that he was sinful, he was just incomplete. So in healing this man, Jesus said this, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud or clay with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes. The word clay here comes from the Hebrew word Adamah, A-D-A-M-A-H. A-D-M-A-H. It's the word we get the name Adam from. So in Genesis, when God formed Adam out of the dust of the earth, he formed Adam out of the Adamah of the earth. This is the same clay that Jesus creates here. So he's by using this clay, Adamah, he is drawing a clear allusion to creation, to the creation story. So the only thing wrong with this man was that creation was not completed in him. So on this Sabbath day, remember this is a Sabbath, Jesus completes his creation using the same material from which Adam was originally created. And now the blind man is not only complete, but because he's not blind, he can now completely enter the life of his community. The thing that had kept him excluded is now made complete. His community had excluded him because of their incorrect ideas about God and about sin. But Jesus shows us the blind man had done nothing to warrant his exclusion. It was actually incorrect thinking about God that caused him to be excluded. So this all causes quite a stir. People who are blind, sinners, under God's curse, are not supposed to just get better. This happened on a Sabbath, too. This causes an even bigger problem. It actually causes a pretty massive theological problem. Just before Jesus put clay on the man's eyes, he said this, "We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work." In that one sentence, Jesus uses the word work in its verb and noun forms 3 times. This is a really big theological problem. Why? Because the Pharisees took Sabbath observance very seriously. Remember in the creation story, God didn't work on the Sabbath. Genesis 2:3 says, "So God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation." So according to their scriptures, God does not work on the Sabbath. He rests on the Sabbath. But Jesus repeatedly works on the Sabbath. This is not the first instance of it. We see it all through the Gospels where he heals people on the Sabbath. It's like he's drawing attention to this fact, to teach us that God doesn't stop working on the Sabbath. He says it right here, "We must work the works of him who sent me." And he's actually claiming that he's doing God's work on the Sabbath. You see that? This gets the formerly blind man an audience not just with his neighbors, but with the religious leaders, because this is a problem. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day that Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes, and then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." So now this cursed sinner has something the Pharisees want too. His neighbors saw that he had something they wanted. How does this happen? Where is Jesus? Now the Pharisees are asking the same thing. This cursed sinner is speaking to the leaders of his community now, not just his neighbors, not just his family. A few minutes ago, this would never have happened. He would never have had this opportunity. But Jesus makes the blind to speak. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath," speaking of Jesus. But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." So Jesus doing this work on the Sabbath divides the religious leaders. Are they going to go with Moses and the law, which requires no work on the Sabbath? Or are they going to recognize the clear act of creation that is standing and seeing and speaking right in front of them? They have this problem. Their council must act in unity, but they're divided. So they call the man's parents in, hoping that they will say, actually, he wasn't born blind. If they could say that, that would help them unify. But his parents don't oblige. They say, ask him, he's of age, ask him, and he'll speak for himself. They're afraid of being blackballed. It says in the text that they feared being put out of the synagogue. So they're afraid of losing their inclusion in their religious community. So rather than standing up for their own son, they throw him back to the religious gatekeepers. This is remarkable. This is the son that's been blind. They know, and it's been blind from birth. It kind of speaks to me that they had agreed with what their culture thought, that there must be something wrong with my son to be in this condition. And even with him being healed, they're not brave enough to stand with him. They say, yeah, sorry, you're on your own son, and they throw him back to the Pharisees. If Jesus had healed this man on any other day of the week, the Pharisees would not have been in this conundrum. But it's the fact that he did this healing on the Sabbath that divides them. Otherwise, they could have said, yeah, it's a miracle, it's a healing, but it wouldn't have caused division because it wouldn't have been on the Sabbath. So they call the man back. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, I do not know whether he's a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. When they say give glory to God, they're putting the man under oath. This is a phrase they would use to put you under an oath and say you must tell the truth now. But he won't give them the answer they're looking for. He won't say that Jesus is a sinner, and he won't say that he is not a sinner. That's what they're asking for. Because if they can get him to say he's a sinner, then they can be united not against him, but against Jesus. Because he's then come on their side, you see. He could have said that Jesus was a sinner. It would have diverted the Pharisees' attention away from him and toward Jesus. But Jesus had opened his eyes. And having been a blind beggar all of his life, he sees things from a different angle, a different perspective. He knows what it's like to be the outcast. He knows what it's like to be the excluded one. And he decides he's not going to be an excluder. So he won't take sides in their theological debate. He says, I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. One thing I do know, I was blind and now I see. He just told them the facts. He doesn't pass judgment on Jesus. He sees how this sacrificial religious game is played, and he's not going to play it. He actually knows the cost of being excluded, and he's not going to be a part of doing that to Jesus. So this unites the Pharisees against him, and they throw him out. Now, all up to this point in the story, this man has not seen Jesus yet. Remember, Jesus encountered him, put mud on his eyes, told him to go wash, and then he's never actually seen the man Jesus yet. In verse 35, Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. He said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. So this man now sees much more than what's coming in through his eyes. I mean, God had opened his eyes, but he sees much more than that, right? He sees God in the person of Jesus. He sees how his society and his religious leaders misunderstand God and how they misunderstand sin. He sees how valuable he is now in God's eyes. And seeing all this, he worships Jesus. So that brings us to the ending bookend in the story again. Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. You see how Jesus judges the world? We actually judge ourselves. He just defines the line, and we choose which side of the line we want to be on. That's how the judgment of God works. Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we're not blind, are we?" So apparently some of these Pharisees followed the man out of the synagogue when he left. And they say, "Surely we're not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." So the story began with a question and some assumptions about sin. The story ends with a judgment. And the judgment turns on its head what the people assumed about sin. The beginning bookend is an assumption that blindness is the result of sin, which justifies the exclusion of people that were blind. They also excluded people who were lame, who had leprosy, all kinds of physical defects. But the ending bookend judges that assumption as incorrect. If you think you can see clearly, it's actually you who are blind. And if you think you can see clearly to judge others, it's you who remain sinful, is what Jesus is saying here. So this story is a call to great humility. Because we all love to see things clearly, don't we? It's a call to being very, very cautious about calling others sinful or calling others blind. In giving this man his sight, Jesus also gave him a voice. And this gave him an audience with his neighbors and even the religious leaders. And in those conversations, he speaks some very deep theological truth. He understood that Jesus was a prophet. How? Just through his gratuitous act of kindness that he did to him. He said if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. That's a very prescient theological concept, meaning that he understands that God is light. In him there's no darkness or shadow of turning. God only gives good things. And that God completes, includes, and gives voice to the people that we victimize and exclude. This, I think, is the value of listening to our culture's victims. This is how attending to our culture's victims can heal our blindness. This is why Jesus makes the blind to speak, because they have a different perspective on things than we do, who aren't excluded and aren't victims of our society. This man, it didn't take long for him to see through the religious system. After somebody, Jesus, revealed to him that he wasn't blind because of sin. After Jesus completed creation in him, he could see something clearly theologically that even his religious experts couldn't see. I think that's important for us to remember, that people who are excluded, that are victimized by cultures, have a different vantage point. It's what Allison calls the intelligence of the victim. They have a vantage point that we don't have if we're in the privileged majority. So I'll conclude with a couple quotes from James Allison. The first one we read at the beginning. Sin ceases to be a defect which excludes and comes to be participation in the mechanism of exclusion. And then the other one is this: sin is resistance in the name of God to the creative work of God which seeks to include us all. Sin is resistance in the name of God to the creative work of God which seeks to include us all. He's saying whenever we resist, when we think we're judging rightly and we're actually resisting God's creative work in somebody, we're the sinner, not them. Now, we love to identify with the blind man in this story. I love to identify with the blind man. It's wonderful to see all these things in this story like we've talked today. But we should not forget to identify with the Pharisees. Because Jesus said, now that you say, we see, your sin remains. And I think it works both directions. It's so tempting to feel good and righteous in our newfound sight. Like when you read this story from the perspective of the blind man and you see all these things that maybe you didn't see before, now you feel empowered and able to judge rightly. But Jesus, the whole point of this story is to caution us against that. It is so tempting to feel good and righteous in our newfound sight that we become righteous judges of the Pharisees. But when we do that, we become just like the Pharisees, because they thought they were the righteous judges. And when we do that, we become the excluders, just of a different group of people. This is also sinful. So Jesus heals us and gives us a voice. But how do we use our voice in ways that don't exclude and victimize? How can we help excluded people to have a voice, but not give them a voice that causes them to be excluders? I think this is really an important question for our societies today. We're so divided in our society, and we tend to pick a side and land on that side, and then judge and exclude the people on the other side. And then, of course, the people on the other side do the same thing to us. I think that one of the big values of this story is to caution us against that. Caution us against using exclusionary language against others. And it's not easy. It's difficult. But that's what I wanted to throw it open for discussion today with, is how can we learn from this story not only the value of including people that our society excludes, but then the next step is how do we, after doing that, not be excluders of the people that excluded them.